This video is sponsored by Game Toppers. Turn your own kitchen or dining room table into a premium portable game solution at a fraction of the cost. Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 756. Today we're going to talk about Flashpoint South China Sea, and this is Flashpoint Series Volume 1, so there may be other games in this series that are probably similar mechanics or maybe different mechanics and similar sort of weight. This is designed by Harold Buchanan, who also did Liberty or Death, one of the coin games that I'm a fan of. What this game is, it is a card-driven game, not unlike Twilight Struggle type of thing or 1960, that kind of a game, but with a very kind of unique twist and take on it. It's also a little bit more of a medium weight kind of game, and it's also a take on a, I would say, very modern setting of this sort of the South China Sea, with some of the other Asian countries involved and the US involved. So one player takes the role of China, the other one takes the role of the United States, at least their governments, and you are trying to do kind of area control and get, you know, position and standing in diplomatic and economic spaces, as well as some naval spaces in the sea. You'll get a look at that when we look at the board. And it's all driven by cards, and players have a hand of cards with events that you can play for the events, or kind of like the ops points kind of thing, which we've seen before. But it's a very different kind of way that the game tackles it. And it is designed from the ground up to be a 1 or a 2 player game. So let's go down to the table and I'll show you how it works, and I'll come back and tell you what I think. Okay, I've got the game, how it might look at setup here. You can see a few things about this map. You've got various different locations here. These represent some different countries. And you have these oval types of spaces here that are attached back to a country there. These are kind of some naval spaces there. You've got some areas for reserves on the US. Up here at the top, areas for reserve pieces. These cubes here for China up on the left. Along the bottom here you have different scoring cards, and this is the only way to score points in the game, is to activate these scoring cards. So through the course of play, players will be triggering these scoring cards in each of the 3 different rounds, and then at the end of the game you're going to go through and just run through them all again and score them individually, and then you're going to get points that way. Now the way the points work is very similar to Twilight Struggle. As you get points, you're going to start to go back and forth here. So if the United States gets points, this marker starts to move that way. China gets points, it starts to move back. If it ever gets to 15 points on either side, that's an instant victory. Otherwise, wherever it ends up here, that side will be the winner. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, let's just zoom out a little bit here. This is all driven by card play. So you have here your event deck, and these are the cards that players will play. You can see there's US cards, China cards, and kind of like neutral cards here. And they have different operations values, different modes, which is a kind of a neat feature, and then also a different event text, so you can play it for kind of the ops. You can activate the mode to do the event, or there's even like a little scoring icon. And so these different scoring icons match these cards here. So if I played this for scoring, I'd be activating the Indonesia scoring card here, score that, and then this will go face down until the end of the round when it gets flipped back up, and then it can be scored again the next round. So each of these can only be scored once. So you get a hand of 6 of these cards every round, and there's 3 rounds or 3 campaigns that's tracked here. So you play the game 3 rounds, and then whoever has the most points is the winner. If you play it solo, you've also got a little solo deck here, and you'll flip this over sometimes. Sometimes you'll just play a card off the top of the deck and act as the solo AI. And sometimes you'll have to flip this one to kind of decide, you know, where it places pieces and stuff. I'm not going to go over the solo rules. They're pretty simple. I will make a mention, though. There is 2 rule books. There's the 2-player rules, and there's the solo rules. So if you wanted to buy this only for solo, you can get rid of this book here. And then you can just read this book, because it'll teach you the whole game, including solo rules. If you don't want to play it solo, you can just play it 2-player and just read this book. And that's fine. There's also a little playbook, which is nice, that GMT Games does, to give you kind of like backgrounds on the cards and some examples and tips and stuff like that. So that's also included here. Now the way that you try to win and try to get the points is by having area majority. So let's zoom in here. We talked about Indonesia. So if you do the Indonesia card, the scoring card here, you'll compare all of the cubes here. So right now they're tied. There's 1 cube on each side. So if China had played it and it was looking something like this, they had 2 economic cubes, and 1 diplomatic cube. Then you should just look at the difference there. So they have 2 more than Indonesia. And then, so in that point, China would score 2 points. Now, some of the cards have little abilities here, and it's worth to note some of these have a maximum number of points. You can't get more than 2 points out of the Indonesia card. But also this one does, the scoring side moves 1 cube from reserve to available. And you can see up here, we have the available pool and the reserve pool. So one of the benefits of scoring that is you can move that out there, because to bring a cube from off of your kind of reserve over here, it's got to be in the available slot, and then you can move it onto the board. Otherwise, you have to spend actions to move it out of reserve first, and then you can move it out there. Now, the other things that you might score is you might look at all of the economic impacts and majorities of the different countries there, and so you would score the difference in countries, not in pieces, but you would look at each country, look at who has the majority, and whoever has the most majority. So let's say the US had majority in 3 of the countries, and China had majority in 2 of the countries on the economic row, then the US would be winning 3-2. And when we scored the economic card, which we can see here, they would score the difference in points there. And then you can also score the difference here on these little naval spaces here. The China side is called CR. The American side is called phone ops. So there's a scoring card there. So you're scoring here the different countries, the overall, naval aspect of it, the economic aspect of it. And it's worth noting, when you score some of these countries that have sort of these little offshoot island spaces, then you will total up all the cubes in here and in here. If you're scoring Malaysia, for example, you total up all the Malaysia cubes and then all the cubes that are attached to it here in the Spratly Islands. So that's how you score, and that's how you win. So again, you score each of these once per round, and then at the end of the game, you're going to flip all these cards back up and score them all again. Now, how do you get cubes out here to get the majority? Well, there's a few different ways to do it. Obviously, you can play the cards for the event, and that's going to just do, so many different things, right? All these different things. Now, one of the main ways is you're going to play for the ops points. And you will see here, you have events that are sort of China related, some that are kind of neutral, and then some that are US related, right? So it doesn't matter what color the card is in terms of the points. You can just play the card and then do the thing. Now, there is a nice set of player aids, which I'll show you. So on this side here, you have all the things you can do with your ops points, which isn't a ton, but it gives you the idea here. Now, so you can see some of these, the cost will go up. So if you're going to place a CR and increase the tension, then you can see if there's any prerequisites here, but you can see the cost to do that goes up. So it costs you 1 op, 0.2, and then 3, and that's as the tension goes higher, it's going to cost more. And if a tension is critical, then this is just not impossible to do at that point. So this is a nice quick reference here. And then on the other side, there's 2 of these sheets though. It gives you just kind of the quick round structure and all that kind of stuff. So it's just very easy to reference all the steps that you might do, draw the new cards, flip the scoring cards face up, and all that stuff. And while we're talking about player aids, there is a player aid that is US on one side and China on the other. So you can play as China or the US on that side. So let's go back to talking about what you can do with the op points. The first thing you can do is just simply place an influence. So if you have a cube, again, in your available, not in your reserve, you can spend a point to just move it out there and put your influence on there. Now notice that you can actually lock these regions here, and that will prevent the other player from doing that place influence action, but we'll talk about how to lock a region. But that's a very simple thing. You just place influence. And so if I had, 3 op points, I could do that 3 times. Or I could mix and match these op points with the different operations. So another thing you might do in addition to placing the influence is, as I mentioned earlier, you can spend 1 of those points to move it from reserve to available. The other thing you could do is you could place if you're the US, place a phone op, and that's always going to cost you 1 if you're the US. Now again, I showed you China. Their cost is going to go up based on the tension level. Now the difference is here is that the US phone ops here, these are going to disappear every round. These are going to go away. The China ones, once they're placed, they stay there unless some other like event card or something removes them. But for the most part, they're going to stay there, and that's going to be a piece they're going to have for the rest of the game. Now, in either case, whether it's US or China, and they place a card or a cube out here in these islands, the tension level is going to increase. And here you have the tension track, so we'll just boom, move that up. And there will be other events and things that move that up and down. Now, it is worth noting, anytime somebody does any kind of action or anything that moves this to critical, then they have to then take and move one of their available cubes to the reserve for being the culprit to move everything to critical. Now the last thing we can do here, the last two things I should say, is we can do a political warfare thing. So we can place one of our markers here in the political warfare. And then the other thing you can do is you can resolve political warfare. Now resolving political warfare costs you 0. So one of the little trick plays you can do, you'll find this out pretty quickly, is let's say you play a 3 card. And let's say we had 3 here in our reserve. So I could go 1, 2, 3, there's all my ops. And then I can do resolve political warfare, which costs me 0 points. And what you do at that point is you flip the top card over of this deck, as long as it is equal to or less than the number of political warfare, which is a 1 in this case. You will take and put that card, I should say, at the bottom of the deck. And then you will have a successful political warfare. These go back here. You will then increase the tension, and then you can choose to lock one of these spaces like that. So you can choose to do that with only 1 or 2 political warfare. You're just taking a little bit of a gamble in terms of, what card might be flipped over there. And let's see, and it's worth noting that you can also replace somebody else's cube. So if you wanted to do your own political warfare, if you're the China player, you do that, and then that will replace that cube, and the other player's cube will go back to the available. And I think I mentioned, but let's just for clarity, when you do the resolve political warfare, you will also increase tension there. So that's all your basic ops stuff. Now let's talk about the scoring and the mode and the events and all that thing. Well, of course, as I mentioned, in addition to playing the card for the ops, you can just play it for the event. That is if the event matches your team. So only a US player can play this event here. The China player would never even want to play it because it's always favorable to the team's color that it is. And anybody can play the neutral events. They just have the black border on the left. Now the other thing that could happen, let's say the China player did play this card and the US player goes, ooh, that's neat. I really like that. And what I want to do is I want to play that event that the China player just discarded. So if I play a card with the matching mode and the event is favorable to me, or is for my team, I should say, then you can use the mode there to trigger that event for yourself. And so that's the interesting thing. So in Twilight Struggle, when you play the card, it automatically triggers the event for the other player, but this you're sort of putting it down hoping it doesn't, but it might. So that's how you would trigger that with the mode icon. Now the other thing, like I said, is you can play cards for the scoring. So you get economics, the phone ops, let's see, Philippines, Brunei, stuff like that. So then you can just play this, for the scoring, and all you do is in this case Brunei, you take the card, score it, flip it over, and that's your turn. But let's say you had this card, the other player had played it down there, and it's for your team if you're the US, then you can play here, we have this one. So with the mode, instead of just triggering the event, you can actually trigger the scoring of the card that was just played. So that's the other thing you're kind of playing around with here. And that's really the gist of the 2-player game. I'm not going to go into super detail on the solo rules because it's just kind of a little bit of a procedural thing. Basically, you flip the top card of the event deck, you see if it'll score based on the scoring, and then you score it if it's going to score positive for your opponent. And then if there's a mode match, there's like a little bit of a different rule change there. And if not, then you basically walk down these in order. So it'll try to resolve a political warfare, put out some CR and phone ops like in this order, and then resolve placing influence in this order and stuff like that. It's all pretty simple. So you just flip the card, see if it scores, see if it triggers this little mode transition, and then you go through and place cubes as it will. Sometimes they can't because the tension track is too high to do something like that. But that's pretty much just the game. Okay, so that was Flashpoint South China Sea. Let's go through my 3 pillars of review. First, I'll talk about player count. The game is obviously designed for either 1 player or 2 player. I have played it both. I really like the solo game. It's fun. It's really simple. It can be kind of swingy the way it works because sometimes in the favor of the human player, the AI will just not really flip the scoring cards as often as they probably could. But that kind of simulates what happens in a 2-player game if you don't get the scoring cards that are there. But with a human opponent, you can kind of like say, okay, well, I don't have anything that's really scoring right now, but I can kind of work towards that, or at least try to prevent the other player from scoring too many points. and then kind of, hope for a better hand next time. Because you also score the points at the end of the game, so there is kind of a long game that you can play in the 2-player game that the AI opponent doesn't really simulate all that great compared to the 2-player game. But it is fun because there is a tension there with the event playing, because the event triggers aren't on the immediate play, it's on the possible play of your opponent, which we'll talk about more in a second. There's still some interaction there between the player and this AI deck where it's like, well, I don't really want to give them that, because if they mode match that one, then that's just going to give them some points or give them some extra stuff that they can do. It's nice because it's almost like a slight rule break, but some of these games with their AIs, they're like, oh, this is breaking the rules like unstoppable. Now, I have not tried it against the most difficult. I just tried it on normal, and it was pretty easy to beat. But what I could see with playing the harder difficulty, that would be a little bit more fun. So I would say definitely you could play it, in my opinion, normal mode. Just do that as a learning game, and then switch into the harder mode. But again, I haven't had a chance to try that yet. Now, 2-player, I think, is where the game really shines. We'll talk more of that in the later part, but let's talk about play time. I don't know what the box says on here. I'm going to assume it says an hour, because that's about how long it takes. Let me just take a look. Sorry, I should have looked it up. It says 30 to 60 minutes. Yeah, I guess that's true. I guess with the solo game, it's probably closer to 30. I wasn't thinking about that when I was saying an hour. But with 2 players, it's a good 45 minutes, hour. It's on the longer end of that 30 to 60, which I think is great. You've had a lot of these games that are very Twilight Struggle-esque, where they're like, hey, you can play this in 15 to 30 minutes, which is neat. Like Watergate's one that I liked. 13 Days is one that I liked, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's 13 Minutes, which I haven't played. There's some other ones. I have one it's kind of like it. It's not really. It's called 300. I still have that one in my collection. That's a fun one. This is a little different because it's more like army battles, but it's card driven and stuff. So, and there's some area majority things. So it's in that kind of vein of a card driven war game. But this is nice. This is kind of like this medium ground that we haven't really seen yet, because you've got kind of your heavier Twilight Struggle, 1989, 1960, couple hours to play, 2-3 hours definitely with some of those games. Well, sits right in that solid hour range, which is really, really cool. So that's your playtime. Now, speaking of all these other games, 13 Days, Watergate, Twilight Struggle, 1960, what is this game like? That's my final pillar. It's like, what's this game like? So again, it sits in that kind of nice sweet spot, which we've not really seen too many games of. Now, I really like this game. Let's cut to the chase. It does some really neat things, some nice innovations on the Twilight Struggle sort of idea, even going back to like Washington's War, where you have the event cards and all that, and the ops and the events and triggering your opponent's events and stuff. This is a really smart way of doing it, I think, where you play the card. It's not going to automatically trigger the event for your opponent, but it might. And so that presents a decision on your opponent's turn, like, hey, I could match that event. I've got a mode, but do I really want to do that? Because an event may not be, all that great. They might just want to play a card they have in their hand. They might want to maybe mode match it for scoring. And so there's a little bit of a thought process that has to go on. And there's a little bit of like pacing that you have to kind of like learn with the game, which I thought was very interesting. So I think there's some good replay value here, because you have this two-pronged idea where you're making those scorings mid-game and trying to be opportunistic and grab as many points as you can when you can, because there's not a lot of spaces on the board, so it's going to be pretty obvious to your opponent, like, oh, they're starting to get more of a foothold here in the Philippines, so I got to make sure we take care of that. Where you start to see how you can try to make those opportunities score for you during the 3 rounds, but also set yourself up to do really well in the final round. So that kind of give and take there works really well with the replayability and the strategy and all that stuff. And it really kind of informs all the card play decisions, because you're like, well, there's a lot of obvious ones, but then there's a little bit more subtle ones as well. It's like, well, whatever, they can score 2 points for Indonesia, because this is going to make me set up a bunch of stuff over here, and I'm really going to lock this place down. Now, the other subtleties here, which I mentioned one of them during the walkthrough, is the FONOPs and the CRs, basically like the naval stuff. I call it the naval stuff because it's in that South China Sea. And the US is able to do it very cheaply, but theirs disappear every round, whereas China can be very expensive to do it, but once they're out there, they stay there, which kind of makes sense because it's, this is kind of China's local home waters here. The US has got to send fleets there theoretically and have the permission of some of the other Asian governments there. So there's that whole dynamic there. So that's an interesting part of it. And but it's also harder for China to do when the tension is high. So it costs more expensive. So the US player, in a way, will try to ratchet up tension on purpose in some ways to do that. And that's kind of an interesting thing. And so there's some events and stuff that play with that tension, which kind of adds, again, some of the flavor and the theme of it. And a lot of all this is kind of sort of pulled out of the headlines. And there's a Taiwan card, and there's some other cards with economic kind of blockade stuff. And then, some of the leadership cards, like all of the leaders in this area, the Japanese president, they're not really even featured in this particular geography, but they're kind of adjacent, right? So they have the North Korean leader, some other leaders like that. So you can do that kind of, it feels like you're kind of thematically using them as a proxy to kind of have negotiations with. So that's kind of a neat thing. The other part is all of the cubes. You've got the economic and the diplomatic cubes in the different countries. The economic cubes come off every round. So the diplomacy investments that you make have a little bit more of a lasting payoff. But the economic ones you can score immediately. You can make those immediate scores. But again, they go away because you've got to invest more money. Diplomacy is one thing. Interpersonal relationships are one thing. Money is a different story, right? So money is money. Money's only as good as you have it or don't, right? So I like that little interplay there with the economics, the investments that maybe either side is making in these countries, and then the diplomacy side. So there's that other little things, and they're very, very easy. It's just okay, we're playing these cubes doing area of control, but economic ones disappear, or FONOPs disappear. There's not a lot of rules there, right? But there's a lot of subtlety to what's going on. So that's neat. Just a lot of this real simple things, and then kind of that twist on the event stuff just makes this a really, really solid game, and I think a lot of folks will get a kick out of it, mechanically wise. Now, thematically wise, I really like it as well because it's very. This is a lot of these like Twilight Struggle. You could say they came out 2004 or 5, and the history of that was 10 years old, 15 years old, depending on how you look at it. And so that was pretty modern, right? It's within a generation, within a lifetime for sure. But this is like right now. This is like ever present. This is almost forward looking in a way, because some of this stuff is yet to play out with the relationships between the United States and China, and that kind of I can't remember the exact name of it, but that in the South China Sea there's like that 9-mile maritime kind of border that is disputed. China thinks it should be bigger than it actually probably some other people say it is. I don't know, because it's kind of invading that international water border of some of the other countries like the Philippines and Indonesia and stuff. And so there's that choke point in the southwestern part near like Singapore, it's almost like a little canal that China gets a lot of their trade through. So that little aspect of it is neat, that they kind of pulled some of that geography and those kind of trade blockades and stuff. And there's like a card for Taiwan, in there. Although Taiwan probably could have like a half a deck, or something. I don't know. But I don't think you want to spend too much time on one issue with a game like this. So I like those dynamics, and I think this is really, we're gonna step. I'm just gonna kick politics, just kind of rub against it for a second. So it's like a Cold War that we're kind of in, right? In terms of our governments, with in a lot of ways. With the economics of this region, and the sort of growth of the region, a lot of these countries are becoming much more modernized. There's just a lot of issues with the food supply in Indonesia and some of the global warming stuff. I think it was Indonesia, they're actually moving their capital because of the increasing water supplies there. Some of the Some of the food production in Indonesia is very interesting because of the way that it basically can feed so many people and how the implications that kind of thing has. I mean, there's a lot of things that are not my expertise that I just kind of adjacently know about. And then, like I said, there's that kind of canal blockade, and there's the whole the human rights issues in China and stuff like that, which the game does not touch on. I think this game's probably been in development for a few years, so the whole Uyghur region, it's not the Uyghur region, the Uyghur people in the region, I can't remember the name of the region, there's that whole, the way that they're being treated and stuff like that. So that's not been addressed here. But, so it's a very interesting idea. Let's talk about it a little bit objectively here, about something that is, it's a Flashpoint game. And I don't know if the rest of these are going to be like that. Like, let's take a modern conflict area and then make a game about it. I mean, I think this one's good. I'd be a little nervous, like if they did one about Ukraine or something. I'm like, whoa, let's let the dust settle there, before we start publishing on the back of it. In this case, I think it's fine. I think it works good, and I think it's a good exercise. And it's also, I think there's a certain level of education that can come with this because, a lot of people probably just kind of go. I mean, I know people where I live like, oh, China, like. Okay, whatever, you're just saying that because you watch TV, It's the interesting dynamics and interplay of how these other countries are involved, or how they're involved, and how important these other countries are, not just Taiwan, but these other countries, and the dynamics of that, and the sort of global interplay of that. And that's very Twilight Struggle-esque, where you had the U.S. and the USSR kind of proxy, fighting each other in these different regions. And this has that same kind of vibe there. And so it's good. It's just kind of crystallizing the whole Cold War-ness of how things are. And I think that was pretty effective, that a game could kind of do that. And kind of, there's some color, in some of the playbooks and stuff like that, and the text and the cards. So it's nice. It's been a while since I played a game like this that got me excited in this kind of way. The coin games have gotten me thinking about things like this, and so this is nice. It's a much more accessible way of doing something like this. It's very solo friendly. I like the solo. That's a better 2-player. But even if somebody wasn't really that interested in the theme, and they might be a little bit bored or put off by it, but mechanics and stuff are really very solid and very interesting. And so if you can kind of let yourself get into the theme a little bit, the mechanics will kind of carry you home, I think. So I definitely recommend Flashpoint South China Sea. And so take a look at it. Just kind of come out of left field, and I'm curious to see what other games they do in the Flashpoint series, because it's going to be interesting. Okay, thanks.